Today, on Giant Travels by Van, I'll complete my van build by doing my wiring and lighting. Welcome back to Giant Travels by Van. Wiring your van may seem daunting if you're inexperienced with wiring, but take it step by step, look up the resources online, and you can do it safely. Here's how I did mine. For power within the van, I wanted to use 2 inverters. One of them would be powered from the engine and its battery, and the other would be powered from the RV battery charged from the solar panel. So I put a larger 400 watt inverter on the front of the vehicle, and this is the passenger side, and I was going to mount it to the center column where you see that flat plastic there, and I did end up mounting it. It worked very well to use some plastic fasteners that held it in there, and then the wires go here and attach for ground, and then as you can see here they go to the battery. The Ram ProMaster City has a really convenient set of attachments at the battery where you can accessorize for various things that you want to power from the battery. To lay out my switch panel, which had been built in a previous episode with all the electronics, I tried first various layouts of using various configurations for the switches, the control box for the solar panel, and these dimmers that I was originally thinking of wiring into it. I'd also gotten a decorative barrel bolt that would keep the door closed after it was finished. In the final analysis, I didn't end up going with any of the dimmers, and since I've used the van for a while now, I don't think I'm really missing the fact that I can't dim any of the LEDs. You will find probably that if you use similar ceiling LEDs that are nice and thin, like the ones I used, that they are pretty bright, but in the cases of the times when I use them, I'm looking for that brightness. I've got enough wiring here with alternative types of lighting that I can produce a more subtle light and not worry about having to dim the overhead lights. So here's the final layout with the solar charge controller on the board and these 6 switches. I simply drilled with a hole saw the positions for the switches, and I used a piece of plexiglass and then used my printer to print on some paper labels for them and placed that behind the plexiglass so that it created kind of a protected area with the labeling on it for each one of the switches. So here's the back of the panel that's been pre-wired before I take it into the vehicle and attach it and do all the finished wiring. I found that this really saved me a lot of time when I went inside the vehicle by having these short jumpers that come off of each one of the switches, so I could just solder there and not try and solder into the cramped area where the switch contacts are. It also allowed me to color code everything so that I knew what I'd be working with when I got inside the van. You can also see there's a 6 block of fuses here so that the 6 lights are all fused, and then I labeled and numbered everything so that you can tell where everything's going. Obviously when you see wiring like this, it looks like a spaghetti mess, but if you take a minute and study it closely, you see there's kind of a pattern that emerges. The 3 holes at the bottom would allow me to bring in my solar power, my battery power, and then power going out to all of the lights that you see the short jumper here is going to provide. When I was ready to install inside the van, I set up all of everything that I thought I would need, including a fan since it was pretty hot that day, but you want to use your heat shrink tubing, have something to be able to shrink it with, all your cutters, and just anything you can imagine you'll use in the job so that you're not getting in and out of the van a dozen times. This is the way the little wiring closet looked before I really got started. It just had the wires from the solar panel hanging to the left, that's the red and black that you see, and then wires coming up from the battery and a couple of wires coming from the lights that I'd installed from the ceiling, as well as a couple of lines that went under the floor to the far side, one that will be used for a light and another that was for a switch so that I could power a light on that side of the vehicle. The first thing that I installed was a circuit breaker that I'd purchased and sized specifically for power coming off the battery. I had used household wiring, so you'll see some 12-2 wire there, And what I had done, where you need to compression clamp this with a screw in the hole in the circuit breaker that you see there, is a trick that I've used on many other wiring jobs, where I bend the wire back over itself to make it bulkier, so that on a large fitting like this, you can get a good tight fasten down by tightening the screw against the doubled wire thickness. So this is just a circuit breaker on the hot side of the battery power, so that anything shorts out, I won't have a dead short on the battery. It will trip the circuit breaker. One of the things I learned about the inexpensive type of solar charge controllers that I was going to be using is that they do not like to have the battery disconnected with the solar panel power still applied to the charge controller. So you want to be able to either disconnect that first, or, as in my case, I was going to wire a switch in line so that I could just simply reach inside the closet and flip a switch off, which would cut the solar panel's power going to the solar charge controller and keep it from being damaged. So I'm simply wiring a switch in here. This is just an inexpensive single pole, single throw, which just means one line's being turned on or off. And it's mounted with a little inexpensive piece of metal bracket that I found at Home Depot and drilled out for the switch size. Then I used some strain reliefs to fasten it to the wall so that you couldn't tug on the wires and pull anything loose. Everything then gets soldered and shrink wrapped to every extent possible to keep everything sealed and keep it secure and safe. So the next step was to bring every wire for every light in to this box and then label it. They would be either numbers that match the number on the switches, or labels for other things that I would be using. And that way everything's identified coming in the box before I start doing any attaching at all. One of the techniques you can do that will simplify this process is to gang wire several common things together to a single wire, so that when you have to make the attachment, you'll only make one attachment. So in the case here, I'm taking a number of ground wires and twisting them all together, and from that producing a single wire, so that all of those wires will be grounded at once when I attach the single wire. Again, this just makes it easier once you put the panel in place, that you're just doing the minimal amount of soldering within a cramped area as much as possible. Another technique that I've used that may help people is, if you're going to put a crimp connector on anything, if you take the wires and put some solder over them before you put the crimp connector on, you'll make sure that all the wires stay together, and then the crimp connector will get a good bite on not just the wires, but the solder that's passing over and through the wires, and give you a really good, sound, durable connection. So here I've mounted the panel finally. It's time to start soldering everything up. And I know this looks like a lot of craziness, but if you were to take a minute and study each wire and see where it goes, within short order you could see where the wires are coming from the panel and where the wires are going off to each light or fixture, and then match them up one by one and solder them together, which is what I did. For the wires that have to pass through to the solar charge controller through the 3 holes, I found that a couple of the wires I purchased were pretty stiff, and I had to use some needle nose pliers and put a really strong bend on them to get them to make the 90-degree bend and go up and fasten into the solar charge controller. So it worked like I planned, but because of the type of wire I used to extend them, I had a little difficulty getting it bent here. But I did get a good connection. And again, I used the same technique of twisting the strands together and soldering them before putting them in and tightening the screws to fasten them down. I much prefer that way than just putting the loose stranded wires in there under a compression clamp like this for these types of connectors. Here you can see that all the grounds end up going to a ground post. That's where all the yellow compression fittings with the I-rings are looped around. So that's just a ground post that I ordered from Amazon. It has a couple of screws that hold it onto the back of the panel, and then again all the ground wires go there, and then all the hots go to the switch, which goes down through the fuse box. This fuse block uses the standard full-size blade fuses that were used in automobiles before they went to the small, tiny micro blade fuses. You can find online resources that will provide calculators based upon how much wattage you're drawing at the 12-volt that will provide you the right size of fuse that you want to use for each fixture. So here's the completed panel with 3 of the lights turned on. The rear ceiling light, the fridge ceiling light, and the entryway ceiling light. And because these switches had LEDs in them, it did complicate the wiring a little bit, because most switches that are on off, you just have to attach 2 wires to simply the hot wire coming in and out to the fixture. But because these have a light on them, the LED that lights up on the front of the switch, then you also need a ground at each one of those switches, so that when it's turned on, it can go to ground through that LED and turn on the LED for you. So it kind of complicates the wiring a little bit, but it's nice to have these light switches to help remind you that you have a light on, especially if it's in some out of the way place that you might not notice so much. Here at the RV battery, I use the same technique of doubling back any of the 12-2 solid wire to make it twice as thick before crimping it into these connectors. And then you can also see that there's another wire that goes off towards the bottom left. That's towards the second inverter that I wanted for the vehicle to have powered by this battery back in the build-out area underneath the seating. One of the wires that came from the panel was not going through any switch. It was just providing hot wire over to this switch that I built on the far wall, which would be right by the sleeping berth. You can kind of see the wheel well in the bottom left corner there, so that while I'm sleeping in the van, I have a light switch right near my head. I can reach over and turn on what I wound up wiring as a red LED, since red doesn't impact your night vision, so that you can see well when you step outside the van if you hear a noise or something. So it's easier than fumbling on the other side of the van for the switch panel to turn on a night light, so to speak, and just be able to reach for this one that's mounted in there. So here's the solar charge controller active, showing that it's getting power from the solar panel and that we're providing power to internal devices or lights. One of the tricks I learned is that you have to enable this, you have to turn it on. Mine, when I first wired it up, I didn't know that. I was trying to turn on lights and the light would flash on momentarily and go off. And so I went and read the instructions and it said, no, you have to enable the output power from this. And so there's a switch that you just push to turn on the system, providing power to all of your stuff. But everything worked fine the first time. I was really happy with how it came out. So here's a final view with all of the switches turned on and my color choices for each one of the switches, reminding me where everything goes. The switches across the bottom, I installed another red LED for just sitting at night. And you can actually see it reflected in the plastic there. It has red and blue bands in it that I enabled. This is just inexpensive LED strip lighting. And then I purchased some of the aluminum channels that you stick it into, and then they come with little clips and a plastic cover to diffuse the LED lights a little bit more. Those were inexpensive off Amazon, very easy to cut and assemble. The storage light goes into my overhead storage area above the cockpit, and so I mounted an LED up there so that you could see when you're trying to retrieve things. That wound up being very useful, so that you could see clothing items that you'd put up there and organize that area. And then the light labeled floor is an LED strip that's mounted underneath the bed or seating area at the front edge of it, so that at night or anytime you just want a little more light to see in there and reach into those storage containers that I'll be putting under there, you could enable that light so that you could quickly find and work with things underneath the seating area. All right, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something along the way while watching me build my van. Remember, the possibilities are endless, but with enough thought and planning, you can end up with something that works uniquely for you. Stay tuned, I'll be adding videos that explain how I wound up filming these episodes from Washington State as I begin documenting my travels. See you soon. Today on Giant Travels by Van, I'll complete my van build by doing. Today on Giant Travels by Van, I'll complete my van build by doing. All right, thanks for watching. Remember,